All right, I am Reese Tisdale, and this is The Future of Water, one of Bluefield Research's platforms from which we talk about all the ways which companies, utilities, and people are addressing the challenges and opportunities in water. Today, it's all about a year in review as we rapidly approach the holidays, and it's about how we feel about the water sector today as well as going into 2022. To do so, I will be joined by Keith Hayes, a partner in crime at Bluefield Research, and John Berryman, Bluefield Research Sales Director, to round out the table and share some of all of our perspectives on what we've been through this year, what we're thinking, how we feel about 2021, probably more importantly, what we look forward to as we get into the new year. So with that being said, let's jump right to it and bring in John and Keith.
Reese, Keith, thanks for joining me today, guys. How you both doing? Keith, how are things in Spain?
Things are okay, John. The year is finally wrapping up. Hard to believe. It's been a bit of a roller coaster for everybody, but things are good.
Great. What are your holiday plans?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna head over to the Canary Islands. Never been there before. Looking forward to that.
Sweet, very sweet. Reese, are you joining him in the Canary Islands, or are you gonna do something a little more local?
I wish. As I told Keith, I was going to go to try to see him a couple of weeks ago, and it actually didn't happen because, admittedly, I get a little panicked about the COVID. So instead, for the holidays, I'm going to be going to New Hampshire for a couple of weeks into the cold. And, there was a bunch of snow on the ground a couple of weeks ago now. I think it's been raining the whole time, so there's not much snow, but we'll see where that leads. That could change pretty quickly.
Yeah, some icy mountains.
What about you? I'll fire it back at you. What are you doing for the holidays?
We normally, whole family jumps in the car and we do the long haul down to Florida to see some family. But this year we're going to stay up in the Northeast. So I think we're all looking forward to not having to do that 20-hour drive. And plus, it's always a little more festive to have a cold Christmas, I think.
I'm with you there.
Yeah, I was going to kick us all off and say we're going to do our best to not mention COVID, but oops, I guess we already have twice now. But without further ado, I guess let's just jump in and get to it. So this year's definitely been a little bit of the same as last, with the pandemic and climate and chaos to some degree. As we can now look back in the rearview mirror a bit, I want to get your take. What do you guys think was the biggest story or headline of 2021? Keith, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, it's hard for me to select one story. I'm going to give I want to obfuscate a bit here. I mean, as you were just saying, John, I think 2021 has been more like 2020 than we'd hoped for. I think some of our memories about what happened 6-8 months ago, what year it was in, has blurred a bit. And that's obviously, I think, kind of due to the pandemic and how that shifted a lot of different things. And I think sort of the groundwork for some of those shifts was put in place last year. So I would just kind of call out 3 trends that I see continuing to this year, and if anything, maybe have accelerated. One is just digitalization of water infrastructure, digitalization in all facets of industry, but definitely on the water side, with the need for more remote management and more companies offering solutions to help tackle that. The other thing is just about workforce. I think shifting workforce, we've been talking about it for years, shortages in different positions such as certified treatment plant operators or field ops people. And that's the shifts around workforce are becoming even more challenging. So here I'm talking about more people working remotely and just dealing with that. This great resignation phenomenon that we've heard of millions of workers that were employed a few months ago have pretty much walked away from their jobs. And, that's leading to a lot of rethinking about how do you find people, how do you retain them, and what's the workplace going to be like going forward at utilities, at service providers, anyone working in this water infrastructure. And I think the third point here, which we're going to touch on more, I know, is just around climate change, resource scarcity, resilience, some of those sort of broader sustainability issues that were already brought up in 2020, 2021. We've had that COP26 climate change summit. And I think the upshot of that for me has been investors have been coming to us more and more, seeing water infrastructure as a critical investment opportunity going forward. So let me leave it at that. I know that's not calling out, a specific headline, but maybe Reese, you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I mean, without a doubt, and maybe this is recency bias, we'll just sort of, and this is going to bleed into next year, but definitely in the US, which I think it's evident where I am, the infrastructure bill has been the headline. It's been the one thing that's actually just been discussed over the course of basically the entire year and was just passed. Now, as far as bleeding into next year, there's still a lot of questions about what it all means. How are the dollars, let's speak specifically to water, how is it going to be allocated, and understanding that, and whether it be state revolving funds, where those dollars are going to go, how are they going to be spent and allocated within those state programs. But then on top of that, there's the lead issue, there's the emerging contaminant dollars that are going to be addressed. And then I'd say the other thing that actually just over the past couple of days has been of note is, what does it mean? There are American-made provisions in the bill that could have some impacts on the supply chain. And I know a lot of companies are trying to figure out what that all means, where the parts and hardware and equipment are coming from, where they assembled, and so on and so forth. So I would say that I think, that to me, that's the easy one. I would say secondarily, but equally important. And the reason I bring this up is because we've just released some analysis on what's happening in South Africa and sort of the fraying infrastructure between Eskom, the power utility, and Rand Water in particular. But it seems to be that everybody's forgotten about the Texas winter storm. That was February of this year, where 11 million people were without water services over the better course of a week or longer. And as I was thinking about this the other day when we talked about this podcast, that storm is going to end up costing between 80 and 130 billion dollars, which is kind of crazy. But the point being, why I'm interested, I think, in this is, if you're a company or a commercial facility, that could be a hospital, it could be a school. I mean, at some point you have to start thinking about, securing your own, not only water supplies, but also power. Much like it, no different than South Africa or, in Central Europe after floods that happened earlier this year. How do you secure your infrastructure, reliable infrastructure, and water, wastewater treatment services in this case? So I think that's a huge issue that's going to carry forward for some time, and I look forward to that. So I'd say infrastructure bill, and then don't forget about earlier in the year the big storm events and climate.
Yeah, I think those climate events are something that aren't slowing down. I saw something in The Economist that was saying anybody born 2020 and later is going to expect between 2-fold and a 7-fold increase in those major climate events. So if that's a heat wave that, if you're born in 1960, you have maybe 3 of those in your lifetime. If you're born in 2020, you have 21 of those in your lifetime. So it's just something that we kind of can't avoid at this point.
Yeah, I would just say, and there's all the collateral impacts, right? It's kind of a bit of a house of cards, right? When the power sector fails, a lot of other things fail. We're seeing that now. Natural gas, networks fail, other things fail. When water systems fail, other things fail. When there are wildfires in California or Australia, there's a curtailment of water services. So yeah, I'm with you.
Right. Well, to not bum everybody out, we can try to move this into a more happy conversation. Let's talk about what we thought was the most 2021 story of the year. So something that basically, in other words, embodies the zeitgeist. Keith, Reese, either of you want to take that one?
I'll jump at it. I think ESG. I mean, I think ESG policies, targets. It's all the rage every time I open the news or even a 10K or 10Q of a publicly traded company. They're talking about it and what this all means. And it comes in a lot of different forms. I think even in Bluefield, we've talked about how to address this from a research and or consulting perspective. I mean, Keith probably has some takes on this as well. And, we're entering the age and there are a lot of targets, but I think there's still a lot of questions about really what does it all mean? It reminds me back, I think, when I was in business school and corporate social responsibility, CSR was the topic du jour being talked about, what this means for companies. And so that was their late 80s, early 90s when it was being talked about. So I would say that, and I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm not being negative here. I think it's a matter of, okay, this all sounds great. And I think they are meaningful. But then, how are these goals and targets being executed, right? And it's sort of like, what is net positive water usage, for Google or Facebook? So I would say that's that captures for me sort of the moment, if you will.
Yeah, and I mean it's challenging because when you think of ESG, there's a very top-down way of thinking of things, but when it comes to water, it's hard to think about in the same way that you think of cap and trade for CO2 credits and things like that. I mean, it is a relatively local issue. So as much as we want to compare apples to apples across the world, setting targets, it really does boil down to some very specific cases and how, specific river basins are managed even, and how companies deal with it on a facility by facility level, how states deal with it. Going sort of earlier today through some headlines, I was thinking, what is the zeitgeist story? I mean, I thought about what we'll talk about later, just on a corporate level, what the merger of Suez and Veolia means. I was thinking as well about obviously the infrastructure bill, and that's kind of the first key big piece of policy that Biden has gotten passed. We're sort of ushering in a new era and taking us away from where we were the last 4 years, which felt like there was a lot less emphasis, I would say, at least at the EPA in terms of water issues, particularly around, let's say, lead service lines. But the other story I came across was just the Colorado announcing its first ever water shortage. And we're used to seeing this in California and in Texas, but in Colorado, the warning they came out with there, to me, kind of encapsulated what we've been seeing in terms of, companies are chipping away at trying to deal with these issues, but there are events, particularly on the drought side, that really drive this home. And I think, our job is going to be going forward to make something so top down as these like sustainability goals and corporate responsibility, make them very concrete and granular in terms of investment in water reuse and improving the sustainability of different industries.
Yeah, I think the drought piece is interesting. I mean, there was something, I know Bloomberg had put something out recently, just looking at California State Water Project, reducing its allocations to zero for the respective communities and farmers. In Arizona, it was basically shutting off the farmers in Arizona. I mean, it's a small part of the Arizona economy, and it was sort of agreed upon among the states and in the Southern Colorado River Basin. But I guess we're talking a lot about inflation, whether that be energy prices, oil or gas, or, just pipes and pumps, just meter, all these raw materials are getting expensive. Well, food prices, I can't, if this continues, I mean, let's say the Central Valley of California, it's the most productive or one of the most productive agriculture regions in the world. So, at what point do those prices just skyrocket? And, that's real, that's scary kind of inflation. It's one thing, when your pipe costs increase, but it's another when, foodstuffs are really going through the roof. And will that happen? And will the government, whether it be state or federal, have to step in? This is in the US, but this is not unique just to the US. It's the rest of the world also. Admittedly, I'm a little concerned about that. Yeah. So I think that's interesting to see where that goes. I mean, after all, someone just asked me yesterday, it was actually a friend who said, what does water have to do with the price of almonds? Who cares about almonds? And it's like, well, every almond requires, I think, over a gallon of water to be produced, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. Now, it takes a while to grow the trees, and that's why there's this bit of a panic about, there's all this investment that's been made into these almond trees in Southern California. And then, all it takes is a couple weeks to a month and without water, and they're done. So it'll be interesting when almonds cost $20 a pound as opposed to whatever, $6, what it is now, I think. Be a different conversation.
I know our household will be in shambles because we live off of the Blue Diamond almonds. So
there's a product placement for Blue Diamond.
a little advertisement. So this is something it's been kind of neat to witness and watch it unfold throughout the year. But during one of our research calls last week, someone brought up some raw data and said the water-related M&A has hit almost 350 deals this year, which is way beyond what we saw last year. And even last year was pretty significant. So for that, I have two questions to both of you guys. One, do we expect this volume of deal flow to continue? And two, in your view, what's been the most impactful M&A deal or even the most surprising one of 2021?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say the speed of M&A flow will continue in 2022. I mean, from our perspective, there are plenty of investors that have come our way this last year. They're still looking. There's still some assets out there. And the tailwinds behind why investing in water, they're still there, obviously. And, I think a previous webcast we did, we touched on the fact that finding targets is not easy. You have a lot of fragmentation on one end of the market with startups and technology companies, and then you have some huge players that have consolidated pretty broad portfolios of solutions. So trying to find those companies that are between, let's say, 30 and 100 million in revenue that you can buy for a reasonable multiple. A lot of investors are scratching their heads because they do want to get into water. They can see the fundamental drivers behind it, but it's not easy finding those companies. And there's a lot of competition when those go out to market. So it is going to continue, I'd say. And, what deal has had the most impact? I mean, I'd probably say the Suez Veolia deal, which has just been formalized, because, generally the water sector, it's too big. It's, there are thousands and thousands of water utilities and technology companies. It's a very locally sensitive market. So, having one deal be world changing is kind of hard to find, obviously. But these are the two largest private water players in the world that have been highly integrated, providing everything from, engineering services and plant design through to supplying technology, integrating it. So, to see those two companies combine and all the caveats that have brought with it in terms of selling off assets to create the new Suez and rolling in some of the existing ones in Suez has redrawn the map in terms of ownership of huge chunks of the private utility space in Europe and elsewhere. So, we've covered it at length in the research services. Some of the different pieces of Suez and Veolia have come to us looking for research, and it still feels kind of like a fluid situation in terms of where that's all going to land personnel wise. But definitely, I mean, that feels like the biggest deal. And then there's a lot of other ones that I think have been probably on the heels of that.
Yeah, I would. I think to that point, to follow up, what's amazing, before we got on this, is one of the, I think, Keith, you were mentioning that, there's a bit of a haze about what year are we in? When did all these things start and begin? And, the Suez Veolia deal is one of those. I think technically it even closes January 14th of 2022. I think that's really when the deal ultimately drops. I could be wrong. I feel like I just saw an email come through earlier this morning mentioning that, but I agree with that. I mean, there's a lot of collateral impacts on that deal, whether it be, private water, operations and maintenance, or even a utility ownership, as well as, industrial strategies. And, that deal, what I think Veolia is now will become a $42 billion company. I mean, it's not, and the new Suez becomes, I want to say 7 billion. Um, if I'm correct about that. So but they still stand at the top of when it comes to water, the competitive landscape. They still remain 1 and 2. But not to belabor that, because I think, as far as deal flows go, I think Isabel Kesman had mentioned recently, it was one of our team, that in the last quarterly, she mentioned that to date this year, and that's, I think, through into October, there are about 151 private water deals, investor and utilities buying usually smaller systems. So that number was basically where we were at the end of last year. So private water deals are going to be, utility acquisitions will definitely be up. That plays a big part of that. I think digital activity, with the, Autodesk's acquisition of Enterprise is obviously a big one. So digital deals are going to continue. There's a lot of it's, SCADA system suppliers, operators, there's, sensor companies. That deal flow will continue. As far as big deal, I'll sort of wrap a couple deals into this. Over the past couple of years, we've always looked at EQT, who had owned at the time, they had actually owned Enterprise. They had XP Solutions was another one of their portfolio assets, and then Sinagro. They've sort of sold off, but my question is New Mountain Capital sort of replacing EQT as the big water private equity firm that's sort of building up a portfolio? New Mountain acquired Inframark. I don't know if that was 2021 or the close at the beginning of this year, but then they've also acquired Aegion, the trenchless pipe services company. And then on the back end, through Inframark, they've acquired O&M service provider ESG. So my point is, New Mountain has this portfolio, which ultimately they're going to want to divest that at some point. So those assets that they have are real opportunities going forward. It'll probably take a little while to play out as they strengthen those, restructure those businesses, and get more value out of them. So I'd say that's kind of how I feel about that. So M&A will continue, to Keith's point, but also I look at the New Mountain deal, but also that's indicative of private equity right now. Private equity seems to be hot to trot looking for acquisitions.
So while we are reflecting and taking this time, let's look under the hood for a minute. And Keith, if you want to open up about maybe what your most interesting project was that you worked on this year. And Reese, you always chip in as well in these things, so I'll take your perspective.
Yeah, no, I think all the projects were interesting. Otherwise, we wouldn't be doing them. So interesting is, in a way, it's always the filter. But I looked at it kind of three ways going through the list of references this year, the work we delivered. I mean, if you think about it from a technology, policy, and geographical perspective, technology-wise, we did some work looking at wastewater-based epidemiology solutions. So ways to test almost in real time for COVID and wastewater and perhaps other infectious diseases. And that was a very timely project, just to see how the pandemic is starting to play out from a water tech perspective, and thinking longer term, are those going to be technologies that will become more commonplace? So getting information out of wastewater to prevent outbreaks. And definitely. I mean, I think we've learned that the technology is there, but as happens many times in the water sector, the policies and the demand drivers may not have lined up yet. So, we know that they're still monitoring wastewater in many places around the world. Europe seems to be pushing to be doing that more long term, at least at centralized treatment plants for big utilities. But figuring out who's going to pay for that stuff in the longer term is not all that clear yet. If we think about policy, I think Reese referred to it before. We've spent a lot of time these last few months parsing the impact of the new Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. And I think that some of the work we did for our clients trying to figure out how's that going to impact their business has been very interesting. Particularly, how do you separate kind of the hype around billions of dollars being channeled towards lead service line replacement or other consent decree compliance types investments? How do you separate the hype around that from the reality of where dollars are actually going to go and what kind of commercial opportunity that is in terms of spending on pipes, pumps, treatment plants, advanced treatment technology? So we've definitely had several goes at, scenarios looking at what percent growth we think we could attribute to that infrastructure spending, and particularly comparing it to what happened back in like 2009 to 2011 during the Great Recession, so to speak. So that's been an interesting kind of macroeconomic policy impact set of tasks that we tackled. And then I think geographically, zooming out and just looking globally, I know we tend to zoom in a lot on the US, but some of the work we did on infrastructure supply chain in Southern and Southeast Asia was very interesting, because I think there we're starting to see a very interesting emerging opportunity around buildings. So commercial building supply of water infrastructure. You may see slow progress in terms of centralized build out of urban water utility infrastructure in emerging markets, but in parallel, the real estate markets, they are building out office towers still. They are still adding large commercial spaces in these countries that have had pretty fast growing economies, and that is implying a lot of demand for pipes and pumps and those kinds of parts of the water infrastructure supply chain. So yeah, all in all, a very busy, interesting year from those three perspectives.
Yeah, I would say, because I assume you're going to ask me, John, what I think. Just to follow up on Keith's point, when I knew this question was coming, I was sort of laying out, clients we work for. And, Keith has the advantage of working really hand in hand with a lot of clients. I feel like I'm running around a lot. But the one thing that gets me really excited, which to say it's a project, I can't say we're there yet. It's been ongoing. And I brought this up on Dave McGempsey's Water Values podcast. I get really excited about the energy transition and what this potentially means. Part of this is, as Keith and I have both worked in the power sector in past lives. In fact, that's how we know one another, with the renewable power sector in particular. And I'm really excited to see like new players. So I've mentioned this before, NextEra entering the water market. I just shared something with the team this morning. NW Natural, they're under different, they face different challenges. They're a natural gas services provider to the Pacific Northwest. And, the state of Oregon has decarbonization targets and mandates that are sort of coming into play. And so these companies are, one, I think they're reacting or, adjusting their strategies in this world, but also I think they're trying to approach it as an opportunity, right? Whether it could be in the case of NW Natural, leveraging wastewater utilities for biogas capture that could potentially be used as part of, as a fuel supply. There's, as I've discussed in a fair amount of detail, the hydrogen play, like what does that mean long-term for not only backup power or storage, for the electric grid, but also transportation. I think it's really, that to me gets excited because it combines my past life with my current life professionally. And I think that's where the world is going in many respects, whether it be NextEra in the US is a large renewable provider potentially developing green hydrogen, or Iberdrola out of Spain doing the same thing, or other players across Europe. That's what I get excited about. I mean, that's kind of the future. The question is, and this is where my cynicism comes in, will they all move fast enough to make a difference on the broader climate concerns? I'm not sure, but at least in some cases, they're developing business cases to do that. So, I mean, I would wrap that up as sort of a project. I've worked with analysts digging into a number of those different areas, and I think we're likely going to have something come out over the next 2 to 3 weeks related to that as well, based on a conversation this morning. So, yeah, I think that's kind of where I stand on that. I mean, what about you, John? Do you have anything that caught your eye?
Well, yeah, I was just going to say, I think for our unique kind of stance in the market, we get the privilege of getting an understanding of what others are thinking about. What are these projects that some of these multinational, really large enterprise Fortune 500 companies are considering? So that's all kind of encouraging to me, especially, being on the sales side of Bluefield Research. We definitely want to continue to talk to those kind of big dogs, but just overarching theme, it's been encouraging to kind of find out that water seems to be kind of has a seat at the table with these really large companies who are discussing. And at the end of the day, they do have the ability to kind of create waves. So I think it's, no pun intended, but I think that's what's been kind of jazzing me up this year in particular, as we continue to get these requests and have these conversations about engagements on how we can help them out in this water space.
Yeah, I think to that point, this came up actually during an interview with someone over the last week or two, and we're talking about just the role of corporates on water management. And there is a sort of a longer term collateral impact, right? And I mentioned this early on in this podcast, that if companies and industries can't rely on the currently aging infrastructure, whether it's failing or at risk to climate threats, then they're going to start doing things potentially on their own, right? And so if they start insulating themselves from the broader network and infrastructure community, more broadly speaking, it creates problems for the existing infrastructure. Let's say you're a utility and your large industrial customers either start using, deploying reuse or just becoming more water efficient in their demands, then the water utility or the city's revenues go down. And then are they going to be able to raise rates on their domestic customers just to maintain, or even to go beyond where they already are? So it gets, I don't want to get philosophical here, but it gets really interesting to that point. And I think you're exactly right, John. The role of some of these big corporates, and some really unique ones that can influence, like, household or consumer products companies. They can influence water usage in the home. I don't know if anybody really thinks about it. They already are in some respects, right? I made a good example. I'll refer to another podcast. Malcolm Gladwell had a podcast. He was talking about Procter and Gamble specifically, about, Cascade detergent, or, Tide Pods, these companies like that. The less water you have to use for washing your dishes or for doing your laundry, that benefits, but you're also using less water. So, I live in the city of Boston, as everybody knows. Well, Boston Water and Sewer is just going to get less money from me as long as they're metering correctly. So it's really interesting to see how this will play out, and will play out over the next decade and beyond.
Let's wrap it up, and I want to get one last take from you guys. trend that you guys wish you had predicted for the last year?
Yeah, I mean, we do a lot of forecasting, right? At Bluefield, we build models. We try and guess. We make informed speculative assumptions and relatively complicated models predicting and forecasting adoption of different technologies, of how much investment we're going to see in different types of infrastructure. And that's usually looking out 3, 5, 10 years. And so we're kind of safely and rarely pinning our predictive capabilities on what's exactly going to happen in the next 12 months, right? But again, looking back reflectively at this past year, I mean, there were definitely a few things that jumped out to me. So one of them, I mean, going back to January of 2021 was Brexit. I'm mentioning the UK here because it has been a big benchmark for us in terms of adoption of digital technologies, the way that the regulator has tried to stimulate innovation with investment management plans and deployment of new technology. I thought there was going to be some kind of last minute deal with Brexit, to be honest. Maybe I was definitely being overly optimistic there. I mean, that was kind of a slow moving uh, step towards the door for the UK that dragged out for years. I did think, though, before it came into effect on the 31st of January, that they might come up with some other way of postponing it. But, since then, there has been some chaos, right? Chaos in the UK with shortages of truck drivers due to Brexit. Then you had the pandemic. You've had treatment chemical shortages, which have led to untreated discharge waivers for sewer and wastewater treatment plant operators. So I guess I think I was naively a little bit more optimistic that things might kind of hold together, or at least be transitioned in a more orderly fashion. But those are the times we live in. The second thing I was thinking about was touching on wastewater again, just the sense that a lot of interest is shifting from drinking water more towards wastewater. And I'm saying that because we've had several investors and technology companies approach us over the last 6 to 12 months with opportunities for smart sewers, for advanced treatment. And, I thought that the focus on wastewater might actually slow down over the past year, just trying to get some stimulus funding in place in different parts of the world and giving, a pass to a lot of utilities in terms of being compliant. But I think what we're seeing here is, looking further out, there is greater interest in like Internet of Things that's being applied to infrastructure. And I think that's going beyond like leak detection and water quality monitoring, and trying to deal with wastewater, whether it's, sensing the levels of wastewater or inflow and infiltration on sewers. That's becoming a bigger deal. And obviously there is regulation in place around that, but we haven't necessarily seen the investment focus on that. So second thing here after Brexit would be the move towards wastewater focus. And I think the third thing I was going to mention here, and this is a bit more abstract and geopolitical, looking at COP26, what did or did not happen there. Just kind of the end, trying to put sort of a nice face on whatever negotiation did happen, was the China and the US agreed to collaborate a bit more on climate change and reducing emissions. And, I think this whole dynamic between China and the US has a lot of implications for the water sector. Definitely has for, energy transition, China being the largest country in terms of mining for a lot of metals that we're going to need for transitioning more to electric vehicles and that kind of thing. Both countries, are buyers and providers of a lot of water technology. And so, how that's going to play out over the next 5 to 10 years, I think is going to be a big deal. Whether we're talking about, a continuation of some of the sort of low grade trade wars that we saw on different products during the Trump era, whether that's going to mean that, they are going to realize ways to collaborate better. I think a lot of American companies, have already been in China, either producing some products there that they're exporting, but also trying to tap into that huge industrial water treatment opportunity, as China is trying to deal with the fact that about 60% of its surface waters are totally contaminated. So, I think what comes out of that, and whether this recent climate change summit was an indicator of that, I think is an interesting benchmark for us to be looking at going forward.
Reese?
Yeah, I would say in brief, because looking at infrastructure markets, particularly new build, and housing starts. I cannot believe that housing starts continue to be as strong and as robust as they have been. And, why do I care? Well, for every new house, there's got to be, a water connection. There's got to be, for every number of homes or number of feet or meters, there's got to be a fire hydrant. There's got to be, there's all this infrastructure that kind of goes along with it. So, that's all that has continued to be a concern. Is the floor going to drop out? And it really has not. It's been incredibly strong. And I think also related to that with, back to Keith's comment about workforce disruption, with everybody working at home, the remodeling industry has gone gangbusters, whether people need more space in their existing homes, or they realize that their house has been a dump for the last 10 years they've lived in it, and they want to add new appliances. And so what does that mean? That means things like more water efficient, hot water heat, or should I say dishwashers, washing machines, faucets, could be, greater understanding or perspective on hot water usage. And, so there's been this disruption has created a bit of, or this build out, both remodeling and new homes has been an opportunity. And I think Eric Bendler has talked about it a fair amount over the past year, that, there are housing developers that are aligning or partnering with digital smart home monitoring services and solutions. And so that in and of itself is an opportunity. How long it goes on for, I'm not sure. There's usually a correction at some point, but we've been on definitely a 10-year run that sort of seemed to be burning holes in our shoes as we go forward. But yeah, that is the one thing I wish I had predicted that it would continue to be. But hey, and we've adjusted over the course of the year to Keith's earlier point about forecasts, for infrastructure in particular, build out as new developments have happened. We've sort of adjusted as we've gone, created different scenarios, or, based on new model inputs, and the housing starts is one in particular.
Well, thanks, guys. That was fun. A little trip down 2021 memory lane.
Yeah. How about it? So now it's 2022. So it's hard to believe, but hey, I think we've almost made it.
Yeah, almost there. I think it's been a relatively strong year considering the circumstances. Obviously an exciting year. I mean,
Oh, I think it's been incredible. I mean, I'd say for us, it's not going to show our cards, but I'd say, thanks to John, thanks to you, Keith, thanks to the rest of the team. It's been a really incredible year for Bluefield. So that's great. That's what we want it to be. Now for ourselves, we just got to keep it going.
Yeah.
As we go into the new year.
Absolutely. And obviously a huge thanks to all of our customers that have trusted in us over this past year, because as the market knows, as they know, we're there to support them making some really key decisions as they navigate all this uncertainty. I mean, they're in the roller coaster as we are, and they're looking to us to help them make some decisions about where to go. So it's obviously been a huge boost to us that they've trusted us in our opinions and insight to help support them, and we look forward to do that even more and better and even more accurately with our predictions in 2022.
All right. So, John, you want to close this out?
Well, I just want to take this opportunity to say thanks, as Keith did, and also to say happy holidays to everybody. Hope we can make it through this next wave of, I won't name it, and healthy. That's it.
Nice. All right. We'll have a good one. We'll all talk soon.
Thanks.
Thanks, guys. Cheers.
Great. Thanks, Reese. Take care. Bye.
All right. So thanks to John and Keith for that conversation. That was fantastic. We talk a lot about this among ourselves, so happy to share it with you. But before we sign off, please subscribe to whatever podcast platform you're using to The Future of Water. Comes out every 2 weeks. Send us a note at waterexperts@bluefieldresearch.com with any topic ideas you would like us to discuss, and tell someone about it. Tell a colleague, tell a friend, tell your family that, hey, there's this interesting podcast that you're listening to, so why shouldn't everybody else? All right, with that, happy holidays to everybody, because this podcast and these water industry insights have been brought to you by Bluefield Research. To learn more about us, visit us at bluefieldresearch.com. Be well, be safe, and take care.